Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Pacific Historic Parks History Talks brought to you in partnership with Edutainment Learning. I'm Nicholas Puzan, the Education and Interpretation Coordinator for Pacific Historic Parks. We are a nonprofit organization who works in partnership with the National Park Service. Together, we support Pearl Harbor National Memorial in Hawaii, home of the USS Arizona Memorial, War in the Pacific National Historical Park in Guam, American Memorial Park in Saipan, Kalaupapa National Historical Park in Molokai, and Diamond Head State Park Monument in Hawaii. Our mission is to remember, honor, and understand World War II in the Pacific. Through education and interpretive programs, we strive to perpetuate the memory of historical events and honor the people that were involved. History Talks is an interactive series designed to share the history and stories of Pearl Harbor and World War II in the Pacific. History Talks series was designed for students, educators, the general audience, and organizations from across the world to provide live interactions during these uncertain times. Today, we are honored to have our guest speakers, KaiBird, a historian and executive director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography at City University of New York's Graduate Center, and Dr. Martin J. Sherman, professor of history at George Mason University, both who have co-authored the Pulitzer Prize winner, American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer. Take it away, gentlemen.
Thank you, thank you. My name is KaiBird, and this is the book that we co-authored together with a fabulous picture of J. Robert Oppenheimer. It's taken by Alfred Eisenstadt, and I just love the dangling cigarette, and of course the signature pork pie hat. Anyway, this is the book. It took us 25 years to write this book. I only worked on it for about 5 years. Marty spent 20 years on it. He started much earlier. And I guess, the first thing I want to have Marty do is to explain why he had this obvious obsession with Robert Oppenheimer. What made him think that Oppenheimer was important enough to not only write a book, long biography of him, but spend quite a bit of your own life doing it?
Well, thank you, Kai. Begin by saying how much I like your Hawaiian shirt.
Oh, thank you.
and I'd also like to say aloha to all my friends in Hawaii. I was stationed in Hawaii with VP 28 at Barbers Point way back when in the 1960s. Jumping ahead to the book. I had finished a book on building and using the atomic bomb, and had used some of Oppenheimer's papers at the Library of Congress in that book, and decided that a full biography of this very important figure, seminal figure really for the second half of the 20th century, was a good thing to do. I began it in 1979. Fortunately, I had decided to begin with trying to interview everyone I could get to know who knew Oppenheimer. And fortunately, I decided to tape all of those interviews, which I did. And that lasted for about 3 years. I did some writing. I got involved in other projects, did some more writing, got involved in other projects, and that kept happening. And it was difficult to see the end of the light, or the light at the end of the tunnel.
Well, you were procrastinating, just like every biographer.
Exactly, exactly. And one day, about 20 years into this project, Kai was staying over the house in Boston. He had just finished his book on the Bundy brothers, The Color of Truth. And he said, I'm looking for another project. And I said, I have another project. Why don't you join me and get this biography finished? I need help. And so we rewrote the contract, and Kai joined in. Now, why was Oppenheimer important? It was important because the history of World War II would have been different without him, to sum up an awful lot of complicated issues. Oppenheimer was the director of the Los Alamos Atomic Bomb Laboratory, and every scientist I interviewed who was there insisted that he was such an effective director that there was no possibility that the bombs would have been ready before Japan surrendered had it not been for Oppenheimer's leadership. That ended up being a terrible burden for Oppenheimer psychologically, because after the war, he became a critic of the atomic bombings. There you see Robert Oppenheimer and General Groves inspecting the remains of the first atomic bomb test on July 16th, 1945 at Alamogordo, New Mexico. So Kai, when you joined me and I began to dump all of these interviews and documents on you, what was your reaction? I never asked you this before. I mean, what were you thinking when you saw all this stuff?
Well, I was surprised because when you pitched me the idea of joining you on this biography, you kept saying that you had huge gaps in your research, and that you didn't know enough about the 1930s when he was teaching at Berkeley and teaching quantum physics, and his childhood. And in fact, there was an enormous amount of material. It was just a flood. It was thousands of pages, 8,000 pages of the FBI documents. But all these lovely interviews that you had done, scores of them that were all neatly typed. And there was actually too much information in a certain sense, although a biographer never really, for a biographer, there is never a question of being too much. But I would argue that, one of the reasons that it took so long to write this book was that Oppenheimer is himself a really complex personality. What you just mentioned about his role as the father of the atomic bomb, the scientific director at Los Alamos, that's the one thing that perhaps the average American citizen might know about Oppenheimer. But what was fascinating to me was his childhood, his difficulty as an adolescent, the poison apple incident, where he had a nervous breakdown in graduate school, his awkward social relations with everybody, including women, his complex relationship with his first real girlfriend, Jean Tatlock, and then his very complex relationship with Kitty, his wife, and his growing up. Here he is on horseback in Central Park. He came from a very privileged background, and so we had to explain and put that all in context and paint a portrait of what it was like for him to grow up of Jewish background, but in the ethical culture society, which was a completely new kind of culture in itself in New York City at the turn of the century. And anyway, it was a great story, and he's endlessly fascinating and difficult.
And of course, one of the most interesting, fascinating, and complex parts of Oppenheimer's life led directly into his directorship of Los Alamos and also to his troubles after the war. And that were his years teaching physics at the University of California, Berkeley, and at Caltech. He was a brilliant physicist. And when war clouds began to emerge, like so many other Americans, Oppenheimer wanted to participate in the war in some way where he could be particularly useful. So in fact, he ended up lobbying to participate in the Manhattan Project. But there was a problem. During the 1930s, Oppenheimer had been what we would call a fellow traveler. He had many communist friends. He participated.
He was a little pink.
He was pink. But he was never a member of the Communist Party officially. But he was very sympathetic to a lot of the goals of the Communist Party, especially in California. For example, supporting labor unions, supporting desegregation in Palo Alto, in Pasadena. The swimming pool, the public swimming pool, was restricted to African Americans only once a week, the day before they emptied the water and cleaned the pool. And Oppenheimer found this disgraceful. And
but Marty, aside even from his politics, he was a very strange pick as director of Los Alamos, in that, he was a physics professor who had managed nothing more than, a dozen graduate students. He had no administrative experience. And here he was going to be thrust into a job managing thousands in a secret city, no less.
But of course, they didn't know it's thousands. He thought that 50 to 100 people would be able to do it.
Yeah. Well, that didn't last very long.
No, that didn't. Well, go ahead and.
Well, that's another mystery. This very intellectual, pointy-headed egghead who understood the mysteries of quantum physics, but also we discovered he loved French poetry and English poetry and Hemingway, and he was a very literate polymath and extremely sensitive. And so how did he get along with General Groves, who hired him to run the Manhattan Project?
Well, General Groves had one clear goal, and that was to build an atomic bomb as quickly as possible, hopefully before the war ended. And he interviewed a whole range of very experienced physicists who had been administrators, like Ernest Lawrence, for example, who ran the Lawrence Laboratory, the Compton brothers, who were both very sophisticated administrators. But in talking to Oppenheimer, he came to believe that Oppenheimer understood better than anybody else he spoke to what needed to be done to get this bomb done as quickly as possible. And so Groves went out on a limb and decided Oppenheimer was his man to run the laboratory that would put the atomic bomb together, that would design it. Remember, the Manhattan Project was many laboratories. There were Chicago, there was Hanford, Washington, there was Columbia, there was Tennessee, but Los Alamos was where the bomb was designed and tested and built and put together. And Oppenheimer managed to convince Groves that he was the right man. And it turned out he was the right man for the job. And Groves had to really fight with his security people to get Oppenheimer approved because of his left-wing associations during the 1930s.
Right. This is a picture you're seeing of Oppenheimer actually at Berkeley, I believe, right?
No, this is at the Institute for Advanced Study.
Oh, okay.
Afterwards.
So this is after
Yeah.
the war.
This is after the war, right?
Okay.
Um,
But you can see he's a very young man. I mean, how old was he when he was recruited to be director of Los Alamos?
Well, he was born in 1905, and so in 1940, he was 35 years old, which made him one of the older people, at Los Alamos. It was filled with these young physics students who Oppenheimer and Beta and Rabi and all of these very famous physicists sent to Los Alamos.
So I find the story of Los Alamos, it's certainly a central part of our book. But I find it sort of the more interesting, more compelling mysteries in the book are come later when he's accused, after having won fame as father of the atomic bomb, and his image is splashed on the covers of Time and Life, and he's probably the most famous American scientist except for Einstein, and he happens to be appointed director of the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton, where he becomes Einstein's effective boss. But he's a celebrity scientist at a time when science is being celebrated, unlike maybe perhaps these times. And and yet 9 years after the end of the war and his celebrity status as the father of the atomic bomb, he's brought down. And that's the tragedy in the title of our book. And I think that's the real drama. I mean, this security hearing that happened, which was set up, orchestrated to humiliate him, it really turned into a secret kangaroo court where his friends were called and his wife, Kitty, was called to testify. And then the entire transcript of the proceedings was leaked to the New York Times, and everything about his personal life, his love life, his affairs was splashed across newspapers all over the country. It's the arc of his life is astonishing.
Getting to that hearing is very interesting through Los Alamos. And since the Pearl Harbor Museum focuses on World War II, I'd just like to say a little bit more about the war period. Oppenheimer's leadership was critical. What was the essence of his leadership at Los Alamos? Every scientist who was there said that the man was a genius. He had everything that was going on at Los Alamos in his head. He knew the people who were the plumbers working on the piping. He knew, of course, all the scientists. He had recruited most of them. And there are many stories where scientists tell that they were having seminars trying to figure out a particular problem. And Oppenheimer would come in, sit in the back of the room, listen to them, and stand up near the end of the meeting and say, A is saying this, and B is saying that, and you guys think that you can't figure out the solution. But what A is saying fits in with what B is saying in this or that way. And in fact, you have described the solution. And he would go on and explain to them what they had said that revealed a solution that they didn't recognize. He had this ability to see into the central point of almost every problem. That was one aspect of his leadership. Another aspect were the personal issues, which I think Kai can talk about with relation to his wife, Kitty, and the difficulties of a young family being put into that real pressure cooker that Los Alamos was. I think Oppenheimer arrived weighing about 160 pounds, 150 pounds, and he left weighing about 120 pounds.
Yeah, he was always thin rail, tall man, but bony, bony, bony. Yeah, no, his wife, Kitty, if there's ever a movie that emerges from this book from Hollywood, I'm certain that his wife, Kitty, is going to be a major character in the movie. She is really larger than life. She's very smart. She was trained as a biologist and very frustrated to move to Los Alamos with 2 young kids and no real work. And she became a very high functioning alcoholic up there in the mountains. And Oppenheimer sort of was an enabler in that way too. He mixed the martinis, not only for her, but for his fellow physicists. And he was notorious for his parties with his famous martinis. Yeah, no, it's a very colorful story. And however, you know, if you, coming back to the war, yes, he was brilliant at putting together and managing, as it turns out, the secret city of engineers and scientists to build the bomb. But he didn't actually have any input into how to use it. He wasn't involved in the decision to use the bomb on Japan. And I think it's really extraordinary that within 2 months after Hiroshima was bombed and then Nagasaki, he is giving speeches to his fellow physicists in Los Alamos, but also in Philadelphia and elsewhere, talking about how this was a weapon that was used on a virtually already defeated enemy. He'd gone back to Washington and he learned the sort of details of the decision to use the bomb, and he became a critic of that decision, and he, I think, was filled with, if not guilt, certainly some kind of regrets about how it was used. And he spent the next few years trying to control this terrible weapon. And that's, of course, what got him into trouble later. But so that's an important part of the story, I think. And it's still, to this day, a hot button issue. Here we are 75 years to the month after the dropping of the 2 bombs, and we Americans still hotly debate about whether it was necessary to convince the Japanese hierarchy to surrender when they did, or whether they were already in the process of being very close to surrendering, or if the terms of unconditional surrender should have been modified to allow for the emperor to stay on his throne, which would have convinced them to surrender earlier. I mean, it's a very controversial argument historically, even to this day, and people get really emotionally racked up about it.
Yes, and in a very real sense, Oppenheimer himself was very emotionally wrapped up about it. I think it was about a month or 2 after the war ended. He was allowed to visit President Truman. And when he went to the Oval Office. His intention was to lobby Truman on the international control of atomic energy. That is to create a proposal to invite all the nations of the world to join in a condominium to prevent a nuclear arms race. But in the course of the conversation, Truman cut him off and said, when do you think the Russians will the Russians get the bomb, Dr. Oppenheimer? And Oppenheimer, who had previously said he was sure they could do it in 3 to 5 years, was so, I guess, nervous really in the Oval Office, sitting with the president, he just said, I don't know. And Truman said to him, well, I know, never. And this absolutely appalled Oppenheimer. And the conversation sort of began to descend to the point where Oppenheimer finally said, Mr. President, I feel like I have blood on my hands. And that really made Truman mad, because if Oppenheimer had blood on his hands, Truman, the implication was bathed in blood. And he ended their conversation essentially threw Oppenheimer out of the office, more or less, and said to Dean Acheson, the Undersecretary of State at the time, who had arranged the meeting, I never want to see that SOB in my office again. So Oppenheimer was not off to a good start with the Truman administration in the post-war period.
So before we go to questions from the audience, Marty, I think we should talk a little more about what actually happened in the 1954 security hearing. What was the result of it? Did Oppenheimer become a pariah? Did he, what were the consequences of this hearing at the height of the McCarthy era?
Well, I think first of all, one has to ask, why was this hearing? And the very short answer is basically because Oppenheimer began to seriously oppose the nuclear policies of the Eisenhower administration: massive retaliation, brinksmanship, plans to kill hundreds of millions of Russians and Chinese, if a conflict broke out. And Louis Strauss, there's a picture of Louis Strauss that we have, we might be able to show you, was the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission. And he worked with FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to essentially build a case, and a very false case, against Oppenheimer, saying that he had opposed the hydrogen bomb, which was true, that he had lied to the FBI during earlier interviews, that he was a suspect because of his associations in the 1930s with communists. Strauss was determined to destroy Oppenheimer because he felt that he was too influential and that his views opposing the Eisenhower massive retaliation policy were dangerous from Strauss's point of view.
So Marty, let me pose a counterfactual question that I don't think I've ever discussed with you, but what would have happened if Oppenheimer had never been put on trial, had never been humiliated, had retained his security clearance, had gone on a speaking tour and convinced millions of Americans that reliance on the bomb was crazy, that it was a weapon only, as he said, for aggressors, that it wasn't a defensive weapon. You've just finished writing a book about the Cuban Missile Crisis, but really a book about US military planning for nuclear war from 1945 up through the missile crisis of 1962. All of that history would have been very different if Oppenheimer's views had been accepted, and instead, and if his views had not been, if he hadn't become a pariah. So talk about your new forthcoming book and the implications of all that.
Well, thank you, Kai. The title is Gambling with Armageddon, Nuclear Roulette from Hiroshima to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that gives you a very clear hint of what the book is about. And that's exactly what Oppenheimer thought we were doing during the Eisenhower administration with massive retaliation. We were gambling with Armageddon. And that the policies that relied on nuclear weapon were, as George Kennan also said, a false protection. They mask the real sort of problems and the possibility for diplomacy. I think if Oppenheimer had not been put on trial in a security hearing, McCarthyism would have been contained sooner, number one. Number two, there would have been a more honest and open discussion about the wisdom of trying to rely on nuclear weapons for American security. But three, I believe that he would not have convinced the American public to think any differently. I think that the debate and the discussion in the 1950s would have been more robust and healthier. Democracy would have been better served. But my guess is that history would have moved on more or less the way it did, because President Eisenhower certainly had a more bully pulpit than Robert Oppenheimer ever would have had.
Right, right. Well, we've been gambling with Armageddon ever since.
Indeed.
And
the gamble's becoming a little more unstructured today.
Right. So I don't know. Should we go on to some questions?
Sure.
Okay. We're ready for any questions.
Absolutely. And before we start any questions, where can the viewers go to get information about your book, obtaining your book?
Oh, thank you. Is all you need to do is Google Sherwin gambling with, and if you don't know how to spell Armageddon, just take a crack at it and it'll work. But obviously, Amazon, the book is listed on Amazon. The pub date is October 13th, but you can pre-order it.
Okay, cool. So
Thank
Amazon,
you.
there were a few questions about that. And also, again, if anyone has any questions, feel free to type them in the chat. We have some questions here and people who ask the questions where they actually asked me to read on their behalf. The first question is, let me pull this up here. What were the arguments for and the arguments against the creation of the bomb?
Well, the arguments for the creation of the bomb were that the Germans might get the bomb first. A little bit of background. In December 1938, the Hahn and Strassmann in Germany discovered or did an experiment that ended up proving that uranium can be fissioned. That is, it can, the atom can be split, and a little bit of energy is released. But when you split a gazillion atoms, almost suddenly you have an awful lot of energy. And when this information was published in February 1939 in Nature magazine, every physicist in the world understood that it might be possible for this energy to be manufactured into a weapon. It wasn't clear that it could happen. It might be possible. But remember, the discovery happened in Germany, and the Germans might get the bomb first. And if a bomb is possible, that might be the winning weapon, as it was later called. So there was no argument against trying to build a bomb. The British and the Americans combined their resources, and the Manhattan Project was formed. Actually, the day before Pearl Harbor was bombed, December 6th, 1941, was when President Roosevelt approved the formation of the Manhattan Project.
All right, thank you. And we have a question from Vincent. Vincent, I'm going to unmute you so you can ask your question. Give him a second. Sometimes we have technical difficulties on this. Vincent wanted to know if you could explore the relationship between David Bohm and Dr. Oppenheimer.
David Bohm. Well, David Bohm was a student of Oppenheimer's at Berkeley, and later went on with, an illustrious career as a physicist. He also dabbled in Eastern philosophy, sort of like Oppenheimer, who himself learned Sanskrit when he was still at Berkeley. But David Bohm was a brilliant quantum physicist, and actually, at one time, he dated Betty Friedan. A little known fact.
There you go.
So we have a question from Patricia. Patricia, I'll go ahead and unmute you. Feel free to ask your question.
Oh, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Gentlemen? My question was, I'd been reading that the dropping of the atomic bombs was actually not really necessary to end the war, as the Japanese had been approaching us through diplomatic channels about ending the war, and that the Roosevelt administration ignored these attempts, essentially because they wanted to show Japan our power and enact revenge, essentially. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm going to start with Oppenheimer's thoughts. First of all, it was Patricia, you meant to say the Truman administration. Roosevelt died on April 12th, 1945. And that was even before the Germans surrendered. So it was Truman who had to deal with the atomic bomb. The Japanese had been trying to surrender after Okinawa. And what I mean by trying to surrender, they were seeking terms that they considered acceptable. And the bottom line term was that the emperor's life and the continuation of the throne would be guaranteed. Everybody in the United States who was involved in intelligence analysis of the war believed that when the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan, which Stalin had promised to do 3 months after the end of the war in Europe. That was May 8th. 3 months later is August 8th. That the Japanese would have to surrender. Why? Because A, they could not fight a two-front war. B, they were more anti-communist than the Americans were. C, the Japanese knew that the Soviets would take all the territory that had been taken by the Japanese in the 1905 Russo-Japanese War, plus Hokkaido, Japan's northern island. And the idea that the Soviets would participate in the occupation of Japan after the war was their worst nightmare. So suddenly when the Soviets entered the war, as they did on midnight, August 8th, beginning of August 9th, all of a sudden, the idea of surrendering to the United States quickly was the Japanese not only best option, but really only option. So the bottom line really is that the atomic bombs did not precipitate the end of the war. It was the entrance of the Soviet Union into the war. But what the atomic bombs did was keep the Soviets out of participating in the occupation of Japan. Kai, you probably want to add something to that.
Well, I would only add that, it's a great question, but you also want to sort of to know, what did the policymakers know at the time? And so the president and the war secretary and the assistant secretary of war and, his closest advisors were reading magic cables. And magic is the secret name for our intercepts, our intelligence intercepts of Japanese diplomatic cable traffic. And among those cables, we were learning that the Japanese emperor himself had instructed his ambassador in Moscow to make clear to the Russians, to pass on to the Allies, that they were ready to surrender if only they would have a promise to preserve the monarchy, the emperorship, and the person of the emperor. And so they knew full well what the final terms were. And in fact, even after the two bombs, after the surrender, Truman did decide to allow the emperor to stay on his throne, largely because his military advisors were telling him that that would make it easier to occupy Japan, and to do so with the cooperation of the monarchy and the Japanese army.
And that's exactly what happened.
And that's actually what happened. So Marty and I both believe, as historians, that it was not the two bombs that led to the surrender. It was the Soviet entry, and we also believe, like Oppenheimer believed, that the two bombs were used on a virtually already defeated enemy that was already in the process of trying to negotiate a surrender. And of course, our critics, I am quick to say, other historians and many Americans, of course, today still believe that the two bombs saved 1 million American lives, or whatever figure, because of the notion that America, to defeat and get a surrender of Japan, it was going to be necessary to actually invade the Japanese home islands in November, and then really the major invasion wasn't scheduled until the spring. And we rebut that argument with by simply pointing out that those invasions were way down the road, months away, and the Japanese were already, we know from the diplomatic cable traffic, were already trying to surrender on better terms, on terms that would guarantee their emperor. So the invasions of November and the spring of '46 would never have happened. And so the bombs didn't save any American lives. In fact, you could make another argument that the mere possession, the knowledge that we had these bombs in the wings, waiting, gave Truman, who was very much an accidental, insecure president at the time, he gave him the security to think that he could hold fast to the unconditional surrender terms and not give publicly the offer of a guarantee for the emperorship. And so in that sense, the existence of the two atomic bombs may have prolonged the war and cost American lives.
Actually, Henry Stimpson himself, the Secretary of War, says that on page, I think it's 628 or 629 of his biography on active service in peace and war. He says that the war probably could have been ended sooner had the United States been more forthcoming with respect to clarifying the terms of unconditional surrender.
Right.
So we have time for one more question. Is that okay with you guys?
Sure.
All right. So this final question, I'm going to read it. They wanted to know, what did Oppenheimer spend most of his professional life doing after World War II?
Well, there were two phases to his life after World War II. The first phase was 1945-6 to the end of 1953. He was a very active and very important advisor to the American government. He was the chairman of the General Advisory Committee to the Atomic Energy Commission. He was on numerous Pentagon committees studying nuclear weapons. He was a major figure. And that's one of the reasons why Lewis Strauss, the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission under Eisenhower, wanted to have him destroyed because he had too much influence from Strauss's point of view. Kai, why don't you talk about the hearing and the post-hearing period of his life?
Well, after the hearing, he became a public non-person virtually. He was disinvited from scheduled speeches at universities. This was 1954 at the height of the McCarthy scares. And people were frightened to have any association with him. So he became sort of a public non-entity. He went from being America's most famous and influential scientist to being someone who was a pariah, a public intellectual who could no longer have a public platform on which to give his opinions. However, he almost lost his job at the Institute for Advanced Studies because the man who had brought him down at the hearing happened also, Lewis Strauss, to be the chairman of the board of trustees at the Institute for Advanced Studies. But Oppenheimer's colleagues at the Institute rallied and made it clear that they wouldn't stand for that. So he kept his job until 1965, 66, when he retired and was being diagnosed very soon after with esophageal cancer.
Right.
But he spent some years off and on in the Virgin Islands. He loved sailing. He bought a cottage there, and he spent time every winter down there. And in 1963, just after Kennedy was assassinated, he was invited to the White House in a very public and moving ceremony, and he was awarded the Fermi Prize. So this was a result of Jack Kennedy's decision to publicly rehabilitate Oppenheimer by awarding him this prize. It was a very controversial move, but Lyndon Johnson, his successor, went through with it just weeks after the assassination. And he was, sort of regained his reputation as such for a moment. But then he soon thereafter fell sick and died of cancer in 1967.
Yeah, we have a photo of Johnson giving Oppenheimer the Fermi Prize. Nick, can you put that up, or yes, no? Okay, technical difficulty. Are we still on?
We're still on, I think.
You're still on. Weston, just need Weston, if you unmute yourself, and then you have that screen share as well.
There we are. So that's what Oppenheimer looked like in 1963. He was a much older man. And you can see his son Peter off to his, right behind his head, and then his wife Kitty. And there's Glenn Seaborg to the left side of the picture, who was chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission under Kennedy and Johnson. And he's being awarded the Fermi Prize, which came with $50,000. And he turns the check over immediately to Kitty, which got a big laugh from everybody. Okay.
Okay, I think that was all the questions from everyone. Gentlemen, thank you very much. And on behalf of Pacific Historic Parks and Edutainment Learning, we would like to thank you for joining us today. I am Weston Saito, the Education and Interpretation Research Coordinator with Pacific Historic Parks. Mr. Bird and Dr. Sherman, it's been an honor to have you share your experience with us, and we appreciate your willingness to share. Please be on the lookout for Dr. Sherman's new book coming October 13th, if I'm correct, titled Gambling with Armageddon, a nuclear roulette from Hiroshima to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Mr. Bird is finishing up his new book on the life of Jimmy Carter. I think we're looking at in the spring of next year, hopefully sooner. You never know. I mean, we're all stuck in a pandemic. We would love to read some more. History Talks series is an education and interpretive program designed to educate participants about the history of Pearl Harbor and World War II in the Pacific. Your kind donation is an opportunity for us to continue to provide free interactive programs to our viewers. A link has been provided within the survey. And in the chat box, we have a link that will connect you to a short survey. This will allow you the opportunity to share your feedback, suggestions, and any questions you have for Mr. Bird and Dr. Sherwin, and provide a donation to support our History Talk series. Thank you, everyone. Mahalo. And I think Ralph, are we going to try to unmute everybody? Or
Mahalo and thank you.
I'm going to unmute everybody so we can all say thank you to Martin and Kai and Weston and Nick and everyone at the Pacific Historic Parks family. I'll let you guys say thank you, and then I'm going to end the meeting. Okay, so can we all, I'm asking all to unmute. Go ahead, you guys can all unmute whenever you want. And just thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Kai.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank you from DC.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you from California.